In the spring of 1943, bicycles were an ordinary sight across occupied Europe. They moved quietly along village roads, carried food, letters, and children, and passed through checkpoints with little notice. Fuel was scarce, and walking long distances was impractical. A bicycle was not a symbol of resistance or threat. It was simply a necessity. German officers understood this well, and over time, familiarity turned into assumption. On one such morning, a young girl rode through streets that had learned to lower their voices. She was 14 years old. Her posture was relaxed, her pace unremarkable. Nothing in her appearance suggested urgency or intent. To the soldiers stationed nearby, she represented continuity, evidence that order, however imposed, had become routine. Occupation depended on moments like these feeling normal. This chapter establishes the environment in which small actions could move unnoticed. Not because people were careless, but because systems built on repetition learned to trust patterns. The calm of the morning did not signal safety. It reflected adaptation. Civilians had learned how to exist under watch, and occupying forces had learned what to ignore. The girl had grown up inside this reality. She had learned which streets to avoid, when to look down, and how to move without drawing attention. These were not conscious strategies, but habits shaped by daily observation. She knew the sound of boots on stone, the tone of a shouted command, and the rhythm of patrol changes. Like many children of occupied territories, her understanding of authority was precise and practical. The bicycle itself was unremarkable. Its frame was worn, its tires uneven from constant use. It carried small personal items tied down carefully to prevent movement. To an observer, it looked like preparation for a long ride, not for anything unusual. German soldiers had seen hundreds like it, and they had learned to categorize such sights quickly. Efficiency required it. Occupation functioned through routine. Checkpoints existed not only to stop threats but to confirm normality. When civilians behaved as expected, guards relaxed. Attention shifted elsewhere. This was not negligence, it was human limitation. No system, no matter how disciplined, can sustain equal vigilance at every moment. The girl's route had been chosen carefully, though it appeared ordinary. Roads that connected administrative buildings, officer housing, and supply points were heavily trafficked. That traffic created cover. Movement blended into movement. The presence of soldiers made the presence of civilians seem less remarkable, not more. This chapter does not frame the girl as extraordinary yet. It does not assign intention or outcome. It establishes context. A child, a bicycle, an occupied town, and a system dependent on predictability. History often turns not on chaos, but on environments that appear settled. German officers stationed in the area had grown accustomed to civilian movement. They had been trained to identify threats, but training also taught them what was not a threat. Children were categorized quickly. Bicycles even more so. Over time, these judgments hardened into certainty. The emotional tone here remains restrained. There is no urgency in the air, no warning signal. Only the quiet weight of occupation and the slow normalization of control. For civilians, survival depended on blending in. For occupiers, authority depended on believing that they could tell the difference between danger and daily life. The girl's age mattered, but not in the way it would later be remembered. At 14, she moved freely where adults sometimes could not. Youth disarmed suspicion. It invited dismissal. This was not kindness. It was assumption. This chapter accomplishes something essential. It shows how historical outcomes begin inside ordinary moments. Not through dramatic confrontation, but through routine, trust in patterns, and the limits of attention. Nothing here violates expectation. That is precisely why it matters. The bicycle continued forward. Guards glanced, then looked away. Conversations resumed. Paperwork changed hands. Boots shifted weight. The system functioned as designed. And that design, built on predictability, was about to encounter something it could not recognize. By 1943, occupation had settled into a pattern that relied less on force and more on predictability. Control was maintained not only through weapons and orders, but through expectation. Civilians moved when permitted, stopped when told, and learned which behaviors passed without comment. Soldiers, in turn, learned which movements required attention and which could be ignored. This chapter deepens that relationship, showing how assumption becomes a functional part of authority. The girl's movement through the town followed these expectations precisely. She did not hurry. She did not hesitate. Her posture suggested familiarity rather than purpose. To the occupying forces, this mattered more than appearance. Movement that aligned with routine signaled compliance. Anything else required scrutiny. German officers stationed along transit routes were responsible for logistics, coordination, and administrative control. Their focus was divided. They watched for resistance, but they also managed supply schedules, transport timetables, and internal communications. Attention was a resource, and like all resources in wartime, it was rationed. Bicycles occupied a unique position within this system. They were essential, common, and difficult to regulate without disrupting civilian labor. Attempts to restrict them had proven counterproductive. Over time, they became invisible. Soldiers learned to look through them rather than at them. The girl had observed this invisibility, not as a formal lesson, but as lived experience. She knew which checkpoints rarely stopped cyclists, which guards were more rigid, and which hours brought routine fatigue. This knowledge did not come from instruction. It came from watching and remembering. Complication in this chapter does not arise from confrontation, but from proximity. The girl passed near administrative buildings where officers gathered. She moved along roads that connected command posts and housing quarters. Each location increased consequence, but not suspicion. The closer she came to authority, the less remarkable her presence appeared. This reflects a broader historical truth. Occupation systems are strongest where they are most confident. Areas believed to be secure receive less scrutiny. Threat is expected at the margins, not the center. This assumption shaped patrol behavior across occupied Europe. The girl's age continued to function as confirmation rather than anomaly. Children were associated with dependency, not agency. Even when resistance movements used young couriers, many occupying forces struggled to internalize that reality consistently. Habit often overpowered training. German soldiers were not careless. They were human. They relied on pattern recognition to survive long hours of monotony punctuated by moments of danger. Over time, patterns replaced vigilance. This was not failure. It was adaptation. As the girl moved, officers noted her presence only as background. Some may have glanced briefly. None intervened. The bicycle carried weight, but it was balanced and quiet. Nothing rattled. Nothing drew attention. The system continued to function smoothly. Emotionally, this chapter reinforces calm inevitability. There is no suspense to heighten, no secret revealed. The audience is guided to understand how ordinary movement becomes opportunity when systems rely too heavily on expectation. Historically, resistance often exploited these gaps. Not through force, but through patience and understanding of routine. Success depended on knowing when not to act as much as when to act. The girl's movement reflected this principle without naming it. This chapter complicates the story by revealing how authority creates its own blind spots. Control depends on classification. Once something is categorized as harmless, it ceases to be examined. The bicycle had been classified long before this morning. The girl passed another group of officers. They were engaged in conversation. Their weapons hung loosely, not from neglect, but from confidence. The environment felt controlled. That feeling was itself part of the system. Nothing interrupted her path. Nothing challenged her presence. The system confirmed itself at every step. This chapter ends without transition because none is needed. Movement continues. Assumption holds. The environment remains stable. And within that stability, consequence quietly advances. As the morning progressed, the distance between routine and consequence narrowed. Nothing outwardly changed. The streets remained familiar, the soldiers attentive but relaxed, the rhythm of occupation intact. Yet escalation in history rarely announces itself. It develops quietly as actions move closer to centers of impact. The girl's route now brought her into areas shaped less by civilian necessity and more by military purpose. Officer quarters, administrative offices, and coordination points formed the backbone of German control in the town. These locations were not heavily fortified. They did not need to be. Authority assumed protection through order, not constant defense. The bicycle continued to move through these spaces without interruption. This was not unusual. Civilians cleaned, delivered, repaired, and transported goods near command locations every day. The machinery of occupation depended on this access. Restricting it would have slowed operations and increased resentment. The system balanced control with practicality. Escalation here is defined by density, not drama. More officers occupied smaller spaces. Conversations overlapped. Schedules intersected. Movement became concentrated. The girls' presence, still unchallenged, now existed within an environment where consequences, if they occurred, would multiply. Historically, resistance actions were most effective when they intersected with administrative concentration. The removal of a single officer mattered less than disruption within networks. Communication delays, confusion, and uncertainty carried effects beyond immediate loss. These principles were understood broadly, even when specific outcomes were not. The girl's composure remained unchanged. She did not look for recognition. She did not scan faces or alter speed. Her behavior continued to match expectation. That consistency mattered. Deviations attract attention. Normality dissolves it. German officers nearby focused on routine matters. Reports were exchanged. Instructions clarified. Small frustrations were addressed. Their awareness was inward-facing, directed toward tasks rather than surroundings. This inward focus is common in controlled environments. When danger is believed to be external, internal spaces feel secure. The bicycle was positioned carefully. Its balance mattered. Weight distribution affected handling. Any irregularity would have been noticed by the rider, not by observers. To others, it remained an ordinary object performing an ordinary function. Escalation also occurred within time. Patrol schedules overlapped. Shifts changed. Moments of transition introduced gaps in attention. These gaps were brief and unremarkable. They occurred daily. Yet they represented moments when assumption outweighed verification. The girl paused briefly, not to hesitate, but to align movement with the environment. This was subtle and unremarked. Civilians often waited for crossings, adjusted paths, or slowed near groups of soldiers. Such pauses blended seamlessly into routine behavior. Emotionally, the chapter maintains restraint. The audience is not asked to anticipate a sudden event. Instead, they are guided to understand how proximity increases consequence without altering appearance. Nothing here feels urgent. That is the point. From a historical perspective, this escalation reflects how systems designed for order struggle to detect actions that conform outwardly to expectation. Control mechanisms are effective against visible disruption, less so against integration. The officers present did not fail. They acted as trained, responding to visible cues and established patterns. The limitation lay not in discipline, but in human reliance on predictability. As the bicycle moved deeper into administrative space, the number of individuals affected by any disruption increased. Yet no one recalibrated their awareness. Nothing suggested they should. This chapter closes without resolution. It does not signal what will occur. It simply establishes that consequence now shares the same physical space as routine. The distance between ordinary movement and historical impact has narrowed to nothing. The environment remains calm. Authority remains confident. Movement continues. Escalation is complete. What followed did not announce itself with urgency or spectacle. There was no signal, no raised voice, no visible shift in posture that warned those nearby. The turning point arrived quietly, shaped by timing rather than force, and by familiarity rather than surprise. In war, decisive moments often occur without witnesses fully understanding what they are seeing. The bicycle was brought to a stop in a place that required no explanation. Civilians paused in such spaces every day. Packages were adjusted. Routes were reconsidered. Small practical decisions were made constantly under occupation. Nothing about this pause disrupted expectation. The officers nearby continued their routines. Conversations overlapped. Papers were consulted. The environment remained internally focused. Attention was directed toward administration, not observation. The presence of civilians had long been normalized within these spaces, and normalization had become policy through repetition. This chapter does not describe mechanics. It does not linger on method. History Quest style documentation avoids operational detail not because it is unknown, but because it is unnecessary for understanding. What matters is not how the action occurred, but why it was able to occur at all. The turning point was defined by convergence. People, assumptions, and routine occupied the same space at the same moment. The system functioned as designed, efficient, confident, and predictable. That predictability, accumulated over months of occupation, became the condition that allowed consequence. When the action occurred, it was immediate and irreversible. The shift from routine to rupture did not unfold gradually. It was instantaneous. The environment that had felt controlled seconds earlier became incomprehensible. The officers present had no time to interpret, only to react. The emotional tone here remains measured. There is no emphasis on shock. Instead, the narrative focuses on transformation, how a space changes character in an instant. The same walls, the same streets, the same people, now existed under entirely different conditions. German forces were trained to respond to attacks, but training assumes visibility. It assumes threat announces itself in recognizable ways. This moment violated that assumption. The source of disruption did not match any expected profile. That mismatch delayed comprehension, even as consequences unfolded. The girl was no longer perceived as a civilian. She was no longer perceived at all. In moments like these, identity collapses into action. Labels dissolve. What remains is effect. Historically, such turning points are difficult to document because they resist narrative clarity. After-action reports focus on damage and response, not on the human blind spots that allowed the moment to occur. Yet those blind spots are where understanding lives. The occupation system had depended on categorization: civilian, soldier, threat, non-threat. That system functioned efficiently until it encountered something that fit none of its categories. The girl had occupied a space that the system did not know how to interpret in time. The immediate aftermath was confusion rather than coordination. Orders were issued, but not instantly understood. Individuals reacted before units did. This is typical of sudden internal disruption. Systems built for external defense struggle when instability originates within assumed safety. The turning point is not framed here as triumph or tragedy. It is framed as inevitability. When routine hardens into assumption, it creates openings that discipline alone cannot close. This is not a moral judgment. It is an observation of human systems under strain. Emotionally, the chapter asks the audience to remain reflective. The loss of life is not sensationalized. It is acknowledged as consequence. The focus remains on understanding how such a moment becomes possible, not on assigning drama to its effects. The girl's role in this moment was not defined by strength or speed. It was defined by invisibility. The most significant factor was not action, but access. Access granted by assumption, reinforced by habit, and protected by routine. As the environment shifted from order to response, authority reasserted itself through familiar means. Guards moved. Commands were given. Control was sought. But the turning point had already passed. The system was no longer preventing outcome. It was managing aftermath. This chapter closes not with resolution, but with recognition. The audience is guided to understand that this moment was not isolated. It was the product of conditions established long before this morning and sustained through repetition. The bicycle, once invisible, became central only in retrospect. At the moment itself, it was simply part of the environment, until it was not. The turning point did not break history's flow. It revealed it.
In the hours that followed, order returned in stages. It did not arrive all at once, nor did it restore what had existed before. Authority reasserted itself through familiar procedures, perimeter checks, reports, reassigned posts, and tightened controls. These actions were not reactions of panic. They were institutional responses measured, procedural, and shaped by training. Yet the environment they addressed had already changed. The immediate aftermath revealed the limits of control when confronted by internal disruption. German forces documented losses, traced movement, and reconstructed timelines. Each step sought clarity, not meaning. Military systems are designed to restore function first. Interpretation comes later, if at all. What mattered operationally was not how the event felt, but how it altered assumptions. Civilians experienced the aftermath differently. Streets grew quieter, movement slowed, familiar routes felt exposed. The presence of authority, once routine, now carried weight again. Occupation tightened, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. Systems adapt after disruption by narrowing tolerance. This pattern repeated itself across occupied Europe. The girl did not become a public figure. Her action was not followed by speeches or proclamations. In many cases, such acts remained partially understood even by those affected. Records focused on outcomes, not origins. Age, motive, and method were often obscured by the administrative language of loss and response. This chapter emphasizes restraint in memory. History does not always preserve clarity. It preserves fragments, reports, reactions, policy changes. Meaning emerges later, reconstructed by distance rather than immediacy. The audience is invited to sit with that ambiguity within German command structures. The incident became a data point. Procedures were revised. Civilian movement near administrative areas received renewed scrutiny. Categories once treated as harmless were re-examined. These adjustments were rational and predictable. Systems learn by narrowing gaps exposed by experience. Yet, no system can fully correct for human adaptability. Occupation requires cooperation, however reluctant. Total restriction is unsustainable. The very measures designed to restore control carried their own costs, straining resources and increasing tension. This is the paradox of authority under pressure for resistance movements. The event reinforced existing understanding rather than creating new doctrine. The effectiveness of patience, observation, and integration into routine had long been recognized. What changed was not strategy, but confidence. Confirmation matters. It shapes belief in what is possible. Emotionally, this chapter resists triumph. Loss is acknowledged without emphasis. Impact is recognized without celebration. The narrative remains human-centered, focusing on consequence rather than acclaim. This reflects the WWII's approach. History as accumulation, not spectacle. Memory formed unevenly. Among occupying forces, the incident became cautionary. Among civilians, it became quiet knowledge, passed indirectly or not at all. Among historians, it would later be examined as an example of systemic vulnerability rather than personal myth. The bicycle itself did not survive as an artifact of meaning. Objects rarely do. Significance is assigned retrospectively, often inaccurately. What mattered was not the object, but the conditions that rendered it unremarkable until it was not. This chapter also addresses age without dramatization. Youth did not make the act symbolic at the time. It made it invisible. Only later would age be emphasized, shaped by the need to explain how assumption failed. In reality, age functioned as axis, not statement. As control reasserted itself, life continued. Occupation did not end. Resistance did not pause. The broader war absorbed the incident and moved forward. This is how history operates at scale. Individual actions influence systems, but systems persist. The resolution lies not in closure, but in understanding. The story does not conclude with justice or finality. It concludes with recognition of pattern. Routine creates assumption. Assumption creates axis. Axis creates consequence. And consequence reshapes routine. This progression is neither moral nor sensational. It is structural. It explains how ordinary environments produce extraordinary outcomes without violating their own logic. The girl's story fits within this framework not as anomaly, but as illustration. In remembering such events, restraint matters. Overstatement distorts understanding. Silence erases it. Between these extremes lies careful reflection. That is where this narrative rests. The aftermath did not rewrite the rules of occupation. It reminded those enforcing them that rules rely on perception, and perception is human. No amount of discipline removes that fact. As the documentary closes, the audience is left not with shock, but with clarity. History does not always turn on force. Often, it turns on familiarity and on the moments when familiarity is mistaken for safety. This is how the event endures. Not as legend, but as lesson. Quiet, unsettling, and deeply human.